Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. In Las Vegas, where fortunes rise overnight and secrets rot beneath stucco mansions, a millionaire vanished after Sunday service. And what followed was a slow-burn mystery with the stench of betrayal, greed, and a woman the press would name the Black Widow. Ronald Ruden, age 64, wasn't the kind of man who disappeared quietly. He was a real estate mogul with decades of property holdings across Clark County, a military veteran, a devout Presbyterian, and a stickler for routine. On December 18, 1994, a Sunday afternoon, he left his office suite near Charleston Boulevard after visiting his wife's antique store, just steps away in the same retail plaza. He was never seen alive again. That evening, when Ron failed to answer his usual check-in calls, no alarm was raised. The office lights remained on overnight. His Cadillac remained parked. His wallet and keys were missing, but there was no sign of forced entry, no emergency broadcast, no missing persons alert. Not yet. In cases like this, it often begins with a silence too long to ignore. On the morning of December 19th, one of Ron's business partners, John Gibbons, tried to reach him to finalize a property escrow. Ron's office line rang unanswered. By the third attempt, Gibbons drove to the plaza. The Cadillac was still in its usual space, dusty from the night dew. The lights inside were still on. At 10:12 a.m., Gibbons reported Ronald Ruden as missing, not to 911, but directly to a contact at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, a quiet tip rather than a formal emergency. It would be another 48 hours before the case was open. Ron's wife, Margaret Ruden, provided a brief statement later that day. Ron left after lunch Sunday, she said. He was headed back to his office. I assumed he went to see a friend afterward. He does that sometimes. Investigators documented her demeanor as calm, detached. She declined a formal interview, citing stress. Police found that unusual, but not yet suspicious. Not until they reviewed the building's maintenance logs and discovered the interior motion alarms had been disarmed around 2:17 p.m. Sunday, manually. A swipe card had been used. It belonged to Ronald. The plaza had no functioning surveillance at that time. According to staff, the cameras had been undergoing maintenance since the previous Friday, but a nearby gas station had a working external feed. Analysts later noted that a black SUV exited the rear access road at 2:23 p.m. on Sunday. The plate wasn't visible. The vehicle matched Ron's. That clip, however, would not resurface until much later, weeks after a body was found, long after Ron's name disappeared from daily police briefings. By December 22nd, Ron's family was pressing harder. His assistant told officers Ron hadn't checked his answering machine or responded to legal deadlines. His lawyer confirmed that a trust scheduled to activate before year-end had not been signed. That trust named Margaret Ruden as the primary beneficiary. Still, without physical evidence of foul play, detectives held back. They canvassed properties Ron managed, interviewed tenants, reviewed his phone records. The last verified call placed from Ron's personal line was to his CPA at 1:42 p.m. Sunday. It lasted less than 1 minute. Police visited Margaret again on December 26th. She repeated her original account. Ron left after lunch, seemed fine, and she hadn't heard from him since. He's done this before, she said. He's a moody man. Investigators noted inconsistencies. One officer's field log read, Mrs. Ruden alternates between referring to husband in present and past tense, emotionally flat, claimed he may have flown to Texas, but no record found. Margaret declined to provide phone logs. She also mentioned, unprompted, that Ron sometimes carried large amounts of cash and had a few enemies from way back. That wasn't part of any prior questioning. As January approached, the case file grew. So did the unease among those who knew Ron. Real estate associates began filing motions to protect shared investments. One longtime friend told police, Ron was cautious, maybe paranoid. He once told me, if anything happens to me, someone wanted it bad enough. That quote made it into the official case brief, but still, there was no body, no blood, no crime scene. Then came January 21st, 1995. Two hikers near Nelson's Landing, a remote trailhead at Lake Mojave, roughly 40 miles southeast of Las Vegas, reported what they thought was an illegal fire pit. Rangers investigated. What they found was partially buried, scorched debris, bone fragments, teeth, metal wire, and a charred leather belt buckle with the initials RR. A forensic team was dispatched immediately. The fire site was still warm in sections. A melted urn was recovered from beneath a rock shelf. Scorched personal effects suggested incineration. Among them, remnants of a dental bridge, a silver ID tag engraved with R. Ruden. Dental records confirmed the worst. Ronald Ruden was dead. On January 21, 1995, 34 days after Ronald Ruden was last seen alive, two hikers reported what they thought was an illegal burn site off the main trail near Nelson's Landing, along the rocky edge of Lake Mojave. The area was remote, difficult to access without four-wheel drive. Scorch marks spread outward from a shallow depression in the dirt, surrounded by partially melted debris and ash embedded in the sand. A National Park Service ranger responded to the scene. What began as a fire code violation escalated within the hour. Within the debris, investigators recovered bone fragments, calcined and brittle from exposure to high sustained heat. Not far from the center of the pit, a partially melted silver ID tag was discovered. The engraving, R. Ruden. Near it lay what appeared to be part of a dental bridge, fractured but intact enough to later assist with positive identification. The initial assessment was handled by Park Service law enforcement, but once the metal tag and jaw fragments were logged, jurisdiction was immediately transferred to the Clark County Sheriff's Office. Crime scene investigations arrived on site by dusk. The area was cordoned off, gridded, and excavated in quadrants. Each fragment of bone, every warped object, was cataloged with latitude-longitude GPS markers. The burn pit showed signs of accelerants, likely gasoline, and high-temperature combustion patterns indicating that the fire had been sustained for more than an hour. Scattered around the perimeter were metal clasps, what appeared to be melted watch components, and an urn, blackened and cracked but still recognizable. Its base had fused to a flat rock, suggesting it had been exposed to direct flame at close range. No inscriptions were visible. The forensic pathologist assigned to the case, Dr. Laura Hanford, received the remains the next morning. In her initial report, she noted that the condition of the bones made it impossible to determine time of death with precision. However, 4 cranial fragments exhibited perforations consistent with gunshot trauma. The directionality and shape matched .22 caliber wounds. One entry point was clean, another showed radial fracture dispersion, indicating close-range impact. The dental prosthetic was sent to the Clark County Dental Examiner's office. 3 days later, it was matched to Ronald Ruden's dental records. Confirmation was immediate. The missing persons case was reclassified as homicide. Investigators returned to the scene with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. They located an additional scattering of bone fragments approximately 12 feet from the pit's edge, likely displaced due to wind or disturbance post-burning. No full skeleton was recovered, but enough remained for forensic reconstruction. Environmental specialists from the Bureau of Land Management provided weather data. Conditions on the presumed date of the burn, sometime between December 18th and 24th, were clear with low humidity and sustained winds under 7 ideal conditions for open-air incineration without attracting attention. The biggest question wasn't how Ron had died. He had been shot, burned, and dumped. But how he had ended up in one of the most inaccessible desert outcroppings in Clark County, miles from any of his known properties, with no tire marks, no shell casings, and no physical trail leading in or out. Logistical analysis suggested that whoever transported the body knew the terrain well. Nelson's Landing wasn't on most tourist maps. The slope was steep, the rocks unstable, and any vehicle attempting to reach the base would require off-road capability and familiarity with the shoreline. One lead investigator summarized it in his notebook. Not opportunistic, someone planned this drop point. They came ready to destroy evidence. Lab results from the debris zone later confirmed the presence of gasoline, human tissue proteins, and oxidized brass, likely bullet residue from spent .22 rounds. However, no casings were recovered. Either they'd been collected or hadn't been expelled, implying a revolver may have been used. Meanwhile, the press caught up. News reports began referring to the case as the Ruden burn site. The speculation ran rampant. Was it a mob hit, a business dispute gone lethal, or something more domestic? At this stage in the investigation, one point was clear. Ronald Ruden hadn't simply gone missing. He had been executed, methodically, and burned to the point of near erasure. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated, contained, and efficient. Detectives circled back to interviews conducted in December. One oddity stood out. Margaret Ruden had said her husband sometimes drove to Lake Mead to clear his head. But this wasn't Lake Mead. This was Lake Mojave. Different route, different shoreline, and no record that Ron ever visited that location. And that, according to one investigator, was the moment the case shifted from procedural to strategic. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. It was now a homicide investigation with one confirmed victim, one burn site, no witnesses, no surveillance, and a growing list of inconsistencies. The day after Ronald Ruden's remains were positively identified through dental records, Las Vegas Metro detectives returned to the woman who had identified herself weeks earlier as a grieving but not alarmed spouse, Margaret Ruden. She had not reported him missing. She had not called hospitals, jails, or mutual friends. She had mentioned that Ron sometimes vanished for a few days and speculated he might have flown to Texas. No such flight existed. That detail, while seemingly minor, began a new phase of scrutiny. From this point forward, every interview she gave would be recorded, transcribed, and matched line by line against previous statements. At the time of Ron's disappearance, Margaret had access to his business records, shared financial accounts, and lived in the same house they'd purchased together 5 years earlier. She had keys to his office, knowledge of his real estate holdings, and, critically, was named in his will as a primary beneficiary. When informed of her husband's death, Margaret's immediate reaction was documented as subdued. According to case notes from Detective Brian Parriott, subject received the confirmation without visible distress. No tears. Asked whether remains would be returned to her custody. Declined to answer further questions without legal counsel. The inconsistencies continued to mount. Her timeline of events for December 18th, the day Ron disappeared, didn't align with confirmed witness statements. She claimed Ron left their shared home at 1 p.m. to visit a friend before heading to the office. But that friend, a local antique dealer, had already provided a sworn statement. He hadn't seen or spoken with Ron that day. Investigators reviewed Ron's office calendar and to-do list. A note scheduled for 2 p.m. read only, M's desk. His assistant confirmed it was shorthand for Margaret's store. That placed Ron in the plaza where both their businesses were located just prior to the time his swipe card accessed the building, 2:17 p.m. Sunday. After that, no further transactions were recorded. No one saw him leave. Ron's business habits were meticulous. He logged incoming calls, stored backup ledgers, and kept duplicates of every property agreement in his personal safe. After his death, officers obtained a search warrant and opened the safe at his home. Among insurance policies and property deeds was a handwritten addendum, dated late November 1994. It stated that pending review, Margaret Ruden would be removed as sole trustee of a retirement account worth over $500,000. Though unsigned, the document was written in Ron's handwriting and matched journal entries found in his office drawer. In one dated entry from December 12th, he noted, "Need to finalize revocation with legal. Do not delay." This was 6 days before his disappearance. Meanwhile, financial audits uncovered a $25,000 withdrawal from a joint account on December 20th, 2 days after Ron was last seen. The transaction was made in cash. Bank surveillance footage wasn't available. The branch had purged tapes after 7 days due to limited storage, a common policy at the time. Investigators requested Margaret's banking records. Her attorney declined, citing privacy. Detectives pivoted to interviewing those close to the couple. Several acquaintances told police the relationship between Ron and Margaret had deteriorated in the months before his disappearance. According to one longtime friend of Ron's, he had described Margaret as secretive about money and volatile when challenged. A former employee at the antique store said Margaret often expressed frustration about being financially restricted. She allegedly once said, "If Ron drops dead tomorrow, I still wouldn't get what I deserve." While anecdotal, the remarks aligned with a growing theory. There may have been a financial motive connected to Ron's death, but motive alone wasn't enough. Detectives needed more. They expanded the forensic scope. Soil samples from the burn site were reanalyzed for trace vehicle fluids. None were found. This supported the theory that whoever disposed of the body had done so carefully, possibly transporting the remains in multiple trips on foot or parking beyond the reachable perimeter and carrying them in manually. The urn recovered from the fire pit was traced back to a local distributor in Las Vegas. Records showed it had been purchased using a cash transaction. The sale date was logged as December 17th, one day before Ron disappeared. The buyer provided no identification. Detectives attempted to verify whether Margaret had purchased any urns or cremation-related items in the days before Ron vanished. No receipts were found under her name, but the timing of that purchase, along with the fact that Ron's actual remains were later placed inside that very urn before being burned, was listed as highly suspicious in the case summary. By February, law enforcement had constructed a profile. It wasn't definitive, but it was narrowing. The absence of evidence, no blood trail, no shell casings, no direct witness, was starting to look less like coincidence and more like control. Someone had removed Ron from a public setting, killed him without leaving forensic trace, and transported him to a burn site using terrain that required planning and local knowledge. That person also had a financial interest in his death. The report from Detective Perriott concluded, subject Margaret Ruden remains evasive, timeline inconsistencies unresolved, financial motive plausible, and behavioral indicators inconsistent with spousal trauma. Internally, the team wasn't yet ready to pursue arrest. The lack of physical evidence directly connecting Margaret to the crime scene remained a critical gap. But the narrative was shifting. What began as a missing person case was now a high-profile homicide, one involving wealth, inheritance, and a spouse whose responses failed to meet even the most basic thresholds of clarity. On July 21, 1996, more than a year and a half after Ronald Ruden's remains were found scorched and shattered in the Nevada desert, an off-duty scuba diver surfaced near Lake Mead with something unusual in hand. The object was lodged beneath a submerged rock ledge near Boulder Basin. Encrusted with rust and algae, it appeared to be a firearm. The diver turned it in to park rangers, who immediately notified local law enforcement. The weapon was identified as a .22 caliber Ruger semi-automatic pistol. Serial number still faintly legible under corrosion. Ballistics records from 1988 confirmed it had been registered to Ronald Ruden. The Clark County Sheriff's Office secured the firearm for forensic testing. Despite water damage, several components remained intact, including the barrel. Forensic firearms examiners at the Nevada State Crime Lab conducted a comparative ballistics test. They extracted bullets from Ronald's recovered skull fragments, preserved since early 1995, and fired test rounds from the submerged weapon after cleaning and stabilizing it. The match was conclusive. The bullets used to kill Ronald Ruden had been fired from the same Ruger pistol now recovered from Lake Mead. This was no circumstantial coincidence. The odds of the same caliber, make, and serial number weapon turning up by chance in a homicide case, especially one where the registered owner was the victim, were near zero. The gun had not only belonged to Ron, it had killed him. The location where the pistol was found added weight to the theory of premeditation. Lake Mead was over an hour's drive from the Nelson's Landing burn site. Whoever disposed of the weapon had deliberately chosen a location far removed from the body. The travel route would have required multiple trips or meticulous planning. Detectives concluded that this wasn't panic behavior. It reflected forethought, risk assessment, and a working understanding of Nevada's backcountry geography. Divers were deployed again the following week to search the surrounding area. No shell casings or ammunition boxes were recovered, and no clothing or accessories tied to Ron were located. The weapon, investigators noted, had likely been thrown into the water with the intention that it would never resurface. The gun's reappearance shifted the trajectory of the case. For the first time, law enforcement had a concrete forensic bridge connecting Ron's murder to a specific object, one that could be logged, traced, and tied back to his home and inner circle. Reviewing prior statements, detectives recalled that Margaret Ruden had never acknowledged the existence of Ron's Ruger. She had claimed during early interviews that she didn't really know what kind of guns he kept and assumed they were locked away somewhere. But in a 1989 notarized property filing, Margaret had signed off on a transfer list that included the Ruger and other firearms owned by Ron. Her signature was verified by handwriting analysts. The question became whether Margaret, or someone acting on her behalf, had access to Ron's gun safe. The safe had been found locked and untouched when police first searched the Ruden residence. But a small set of keys had been located in Margaret's desk, and investigators now reviewed whether those could have opened the original storage. At the same time, the discovery of the gun prompted a re-examination of phone records from December 1994. Investigators isolated 2 short calls made from the Ruden landline to a local firearms cleaning service. The first was placed December 10th. The business owner said no names were taken, but that he remembered advising a woman caller not to oil a pistol before storage. The second call came on December 17th, the day before Ron's disappearance. The recipient remembered a woman asking how long a gun could remain functional if submerged in water. The calls were brief, no identity was confirmed, but the timing and the content raised flags. Meanwhile, a background check on Ron's other weapons revealed none had been used, moved, or reported missing. The Ruger was the only firearm that could not be accounted for after December 18, 1994, until it was pulled from the depths nearly 2 years later. To strengthen the chain of evidence, forensic investigators conducted a corrosion analysis on the Ruger. Based on algae growth patterns and water corrosion layers, analysts estimated that the gun had entered the water between mid-December and early January 1995. This aligned precisely with the window of Ron's death and the subsequent disposal of his remains. What this chapter of the investigation revealed was not just a murder weapon, it was a physical trail, a fingerprint in metal, a dead man's firearm recovered from a lake, connected to skull fragments retrieved from a fire pit. It brought the forensic elements of the case full circle. But even as evidence mounted, the legal threshold for arrest remained unfulfilled. The weapon proved how Ron was killed. It didn't prove who pulled the trigger. And for now, there were still no witnesses, no DNA, no video. Just a growing chain of data points, silent, exact, and inching toward convergence. In cases like these, where digital evidence was limited and forensic tech had not yet evolved to its present state, the work often came down to pressure, incremental tightening, carefully timed disclosures, and waiting for one contradiction to crack the entire case wide open. And this was no longer a matter of if that would happen, but when. By April 1997, the investigation into Ronald Ruden's death had produced a murder weapon, a verified motive, a burn site, and a mounting stack of forensic evidence. But what it still lacked was a formal arrest. Detectives were ready to act. The grand jury returned an indictment for first-degree murder. A warrant was issued. The name on it, Margaret Ruden. When police arrived at her home in Las Vegas to serve the warrant, she was gone. Margaret hadn't just stepped out. She had vanished, without airline tickets, without rental car records, without forwarding addresses. Her phone was disconnected. The home she shared with Ron stood empty, its utilities shut off weeks earlier. According to neighbors, they hadn't seen her in over a month. One noted a moving van in the driveway in mid-March. Nobody thought to report it at the time. What followed was not a manhunt in the typical sense. It was something slower, more frustrating. Margaret Ruden wasn't hiding in the wilderness or crossing borders illegally. She was moving within the United States using false names, blending into retirement communities, and staying just beneath the radar. At first, law enforcement assumed she would surface quickly. She was in her 50s, had limited work history, and no known family connections out of state. But months passed, then a year, then 2. In December 1999, a new lead surfaced in Massachusetts. A woman calling herself Elaine had been renting a room in Revere, north of Boston. She'd been using a Texas-issued ID that later turned out to be falsified. A tipster, unaffiliated with the case, recognized her from an episode of America's Most Wanted. Federal agents cross-referenced the photo and confirmed the match. Margaret Ruden was arrested quietly on November 17, 1999. No resistance, no explanation. When questioned about her disappearance, she said only that she had feared for her safety and didn't trust the Nevada legal system. She offered no details. She declined to elaborate. She was returned to Las Vegas in federal custody. Her arrest wasn't just about the charges. It reignited public attention. In the years since Ron's body had been found, local media had grown skeptical. Some believed the case had stalled, others speculated that law enforcement lacked a real suspect. The moment Margaret was extradited, headlines across Nevada changed tone. Black Widow captured after 2-year disappearance. But for detectives, her arrest did more than close a procedural loop. It clarified intent. Disappearing for 31 months didn't prove guilt, but it undermined every prior claim of cooperation. The fugitive period introduced new questions for prosecutors. Where had she gotten the money to flee? Who helped her move across multiple states? Were any items of evidence destroyed while she was missing? Financial records during that time were difficult to trace. Margaret used aliases and cash-only transactions. She rented rooms in cash, used laundromats, and avoided banks. One receipt showed a cash payment at a print shop for copies of an estate document, a version of Ron's will that was later ruled inadmissible. Once in custody, Margaret requested a public defender. She entered a not guilty plea. Pretrial motions began in early 2000. Her legal team argued that law enforcement had no physical evidence directly connecting her to the murder. They pushed to exclude the firearm, claiming chain of custody gaps. They tried to suppress statements made during her early interviews, citing lack of Miranda warning. The court denied most of these motions. Margaret Ruden had gone from a woman of interest to a fugitive defendant. Her disappearance had changed the tone of the case, shifted how jurors and prosecutors viewed intent, and created a psychological impression that would quietly influence everything that came next. In many homicide cases, time works against prosecutors. But here, the delay had allowed the evidence to speak louder. Every mile Margaret traveled off the grid only made jurors more willing to believe she had something to hide. And at that point in the timeline, the defense hadn't yet seen what would be introduced next. Financial transfers, estate revisions, and a testimony from a former confidant that prosecutors would claim proved premeditation. The state of Nevada versus Margaret Ruden officially began on March 2, 2001, in Clark County District Court. By then, the case had drifted far from the desert where Ronald Ruden's remains were found, and deeper into courtroom procedure, media framing, and the strategic weight of circumstantial evidence. The prosecution opened with a timeline. Ronald Ruden was last seen alive on December 18, 1994. His body was discovered burned and dismembered near Lake Mojave a month later. In 1996, a Ruger .22 pistol registered to him was recovered from Lake Mead. Ballistics proved it was the weapon used to kill him. The state's position was that Margaret Ruden had motive, means, and opportunity, and had acted with premeditation. They emphasized financial records. Ronald had begun steps to remove Margaret as a beneficiary. He'd rewritten portions of his estate plan. They introduced expert handwriting testimony, confirming that notes found in Ron's office were authentic, and outlined his intent to change trusteeship just days before he vanished. Witnesses included Ron's assistant, who testified that Ron expressed unease about Margaret's spending habits, and a friend who claimed Ron had said he no longer trusted her with money. Prosecutors did not overstate these claims. Instead, they stacked them, bit by bit, to establish that Ronald had taken concrete action to distance himself financially from his wife before he was killed. The burned urn recovered near the body was traced back to a local supplier. Though no receipt had Margaret's name, records showed a cash transaction on December 17, 1994. The jury was told that the same urn was found at the scene used in an attempt to incinerate Ron's remains. The implication was clear. Someone had purchased it in advance. The prosecution also focused on behavior after the fact. Margaret's disappearance following the indictment in 1997 was presented not as panic, but as strategy. Her use of aliases and cash-only living arrangements over 31 months painted a picture of someone avoiding, not fearing, justice. What the prosecution lacked was direct evidence placing Margaret at the scene. There were no fingerprints, no surveillance footage, no DNA. But the narrative was tightly controlled. The state didn't claim to have caught her in the act. They asserted that the pattern of actions before and after Ron's death aligned too precisely to ignore. The defense countered by challenging every link. They argued the entire case rested on conjecture and inference. They pointed out that Margaret's fingerprints were not found on the weapon, that she had not purchased the urn using traceable means, that several of Ron's business dealings had grown contentious and he had enemies beyond the home. They suggested Ron may have been killed in retaliation over money, or by someone with a separate grudge. They also attacked the competency of the initial investigation. The defense team highlighted how the house had not been sealed as a crime scene, how evidence collection had been delayed, and how items had gone missing or were poorly cataloged. They implied that the gun could have been planted or found by someone else and dumped without knowledge of its connection to Ron's murder. Most controversially, the defense argued that the media's portrayal of Margaret as a manipulative black widow had tainted the case. Local coverage had labeled her long before a jury was seated. Her fugitive status, while undisputed, became a narrative focus rather than a legal fact. The defense insisted she fled out of fear, not guilt. Jurors were instructed to ignore headlines, but even the judge acknowledged in sidebar conference that controlling perception would be difficult. A forensic pathologist returned to explain gunshot entry points, noting the execution-style nature of the shots, 4 to the head, with no defensive wounds. It suggested Ronald had been ambushed, not involved in a struggle. The prosecutor stopped short of alleging where it happened, but implied the office or the couple's shared home were the only logical locations. The trial lasted 7 weeks. Margaret did not testify. Closing arguments reiterated the structure: opportunity, financial motive, methodical cover-up. The state did not offer emotion. They offered chain of events and procedural logic. After deliberating for 12 hours, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence, life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Outside the courthouse, the narrative resumed. Margaret Ruden had been branded by the media as a cold, calculating widow who killed her husband for money. But inside legal circles, questions lingered about the strength of the evidence, the influence of press framing, and the overall fairness of a case built largely on circumstantial material. Even as the gavel dropped, it didn't feel like the final chapter. Not to the attorneys, not to Margaret, not to everyone watching closely. After her 2001 conviction, Margaret Ruden entered the Nevada prison system under life sentence status. She was assigned to Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center, the state's largest female facility. Her projected eligibility for parole, 2021. Inside, she followed protocol. She kept to herself. She took classes, maintained a clean disciplinary record, and filed her first post-conviction appeal within months. The appeal was denied. Then came another, then another. The legal grounds varied: ineffective assistance of counsel, trial irregularities, prejudicial media coverage. But one argument remained consistent. Margaret claimed her defense attorney at trial had failed her. Not figuratively, legally. In 2008, that allegation started gaining traction. A federal public defender began reviewing the case. What they found raised concerns not about guilt or innocence, but about whether the trial had been constitutionally sound. Margaret's trial attorney had reportedly sold information to media outlets during the proceedings. He had also failed to call key rebuttal witnesses and had not challenged certain forensic interpretations presented by the prosecution. By 2014, these findings reached the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. In a sharply worded opinion, the court noted that Margaret's trial may have been compromised by ineffective representation, but the ruling stopped short of granting relief. Procedural barriers remain. For Margaret, the issue was no longer just conviction, it was due process. Whether or not she had committed the crime, the question had shifted to whether she'd received a fair trial under the Constitution. Outside prison walls, public interest had faded. The case was no longer headline news. But inside legal and academic circles, it began appearing in law reviews and symposiums on post-conviction justice. It was cited in arguments about women defendants, media bias, and trial fairness. In 2018, Nevada passed legislation making it easier for inmates to seek retrial based on ineffective counsel, especially if misconduct by the defense was documented. Margaret filed again. This time the motion advanced. A federal judge reviewed her claim and ruled that she had, in fact, received deficient and prejudicial representation. The ruling didn't declare her innocent. It didn't void the evidence, but it determined that the structure of her trial had failed the standards required for a valid conviction. On January 10, 2020, Margaret Ruden walked out of prison on a conditional release. She was 76 years old. She had served nearly 2 decades. Her health had declined. Her legal status was technically unresolved. A retrial could still be ordered, but prosecutors declined to pursue it. In December 2024, Clark County formally dismissed the charges. The case was closed. Margaret Ruden was no longer an inmate. She was no longer a defendant, but she was also never retried. In the eyes of the law, the question of guilt remained technically unanswered. There is no forensic evidence that changed after her conviction. No new DNA, no recanted testimony. The bullet fragments, the urn, the weapon, all remained. But the focus had shifted. This chapter wasn't about discovery, it was about doubt. Not of the facts, but of the process. Cases like this leave a permanent tension. If someone is freed because of a bad trial, does that mean they didn't commit the crime? Or does it mean the system failed to prove it properly? For victims' families, these outcomes rarely bring closure. For the accused, freedom doesn't erase the label. Margaret Ruden now lives quietly in Illinois. She rarely speaks publicly. Legal advocates continue to use her case in training modules for ethical defense practices. In the end, her name sits in both lists, as a convicted murderer and as a cautionary tale about what happens when defense counsel blurs the line between duty and ambition. Margaret Ruden's 2001 conviction for the murder of her husband, Ronald Ruden, once symbolized a hard-won victory after years of evasion. But 2 decades later, the conviction unraveled, not through new forensic evidence or a confession, but due to a constitutional violation. In 2022, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned the verdict, citing ineffective legal counsel. Her original defense attorney had failed on multiple fronts: missed deadlines, weak investigation, and a closing argument that bordered on incoherent. The court ruled not on guilt or innocence, but on the failure to ensure her right to a fair trial. The state declined to retry her. Too many witnesses had passed, and the evidence had aged beyond courtroom utility. Margaret had already served over 20 years and was released quietly, legally unconvicted, though not exonerated. Ronald Ruden's family called the decision a betrayal of justice, but the legal system held firm. Rights violated at trial demand correction, no matter how damning the crime may seem. Today, Margaret lives in Arizona, reclusive and in declining health. She has never confessed. The murder remains in the eyes of the law unresolved. Yet the case endures in legal textbooks and training seminars as a warning. Justice is more than a verdict. It's the integrity of the process that leads to it. In the end, what stayed with me wasn't just the horror of what happened, but the silence that followed it. Justice isn't always loud or clear. Sometimes it takes decades, and sometimes it never fully arrives. If there's one lesson I've learned from telling this case, it's this: never assume someone's guilt or innocence just because time has passed or because headlines told you so. Injustice can live in the shadows of a rushed verdict or a broken defense. What do you think? Should Margaret Ruden have been retried, or was her release fair under the law? Have you ever witnessed a moment where the legal system felt both right and wrong at the same time? If this story stirred something in you or made you think twice about justice in America, let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And if you didn't enjoy the video, tell me why. I welcome all views. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next case. Your support keeps these stories alive.